Hi, my name is Denisha Merriweather, and this is our DAUPHIN. We
Thank you,
are
Denisha.
we are live talking about Black Minds Matter and the history of Blacks in America, and we are just very excited to have this event. The featured panelist is Gerard Robinson. And Paul, let's just have a conversation before we get into the event. What was it like first to interview Gerard, and how was it learning so much? And you're brilliant with the history of education in America for Blacks.
Well, Denisha, we started from the point of the topic that now compliment you. You came up with the topic, were schools made for Black people, which is sounds like a easy to answer question, but Gerard is just where he was coming from, the depth of knowledge that he brought to it during the course of the interview. He was schooling me, and I think he'll school the audience. I mean, we went everywhere from the beginnings of education of Blacks in America, starting at 1619, when the first Africans came to America. I mean, he even started making some distinctions between indentured servitude and chattel slavery, as what we really think about when we think about slavery. And then we moved forward through the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, we were marching through time to Brown v. Board, and then post Brown v. Board, talked about some things that I actually experienced in my life with the way integration was happening, integration of schools and of society were happening in Louisiana, where I grew up. And talked about economic inequality, and even took it all the way to COVID-19. So I think everyone watching, I think they're going to get a lot out of this.
Yeah, one of the things that I learned from your interview of Gerard is that writing tablets were found in early slave quarters, because we just think like, oh, education was invented here in America, and enslaved peoples who came from Africa didn't start learning until Brown v. Board, or until, white people started teaching them. But I learned that from your interview with Gerard Robinson, that people were learning in Africa. And sometimes we forget about the vast history and the whole person that existed before they came here to America.
Well, every people, no matter where they came from, there's this desire to learn, to teach. A lot of it is simply, it starts with the sharing of stories, telling a story from one generation to another. And one of the things I've learned in my life is that sometimes the oral histories and the oral stories actually have a little more accuracy than the written word. But everybody is striving to teach and tell their story to the next generation. And what we learned from Gerard Robinson was just this passion about education in our people that went from generation to generation, overcoming just unbelievable obstacles.
Awesome. And what would you like for everyone to take away from this event?
I think, and we talked about it toward the end of the interview, that especially when we got into the Brown v. Board era and the immediate post, as Blacks in America fought for this equality in education and economic equality, that even though we didn't know it, and even as a kid, for me, I didn't know it, but our families were fighting way back when for school choice, even though we weren't calling it that. So that's one of my takeaways.
That's awesome. Okay, and without further ado, let's hop right into it. We will be accepting questions via chat. So all of you guys who joined via Facebook and on YouTube, please submit your questions and we will answer them. Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Denisha.
Welcome to our Black Minds Matter series. Today we are thrilled to have with us Gerard Robinson. Gerard, you have been at the forefront of research in education, particularly as it relates to African Americans from the K-12 level all the way up through universities. You spent a lot of time looking at HBCUs. Mm-hmm. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for having me.
And currently you are Vice President of Education at the Advanced Studies in Culture Foundation in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm going to get you to describe that in a couple of minutes. But your background is just so extensive. Former Secretary of Education in Virginia, Florida Education Commissioner, former President of Black Alliance for Educational Options, or BAO as we know it. Your education background, BA from Howard University, Master's in Education from Harvard University. So before we really get into the discussion, tell me about the Advanced Studies in Culture Foundation in Charlottesville.
No, first of all, thank you for the invitation to talk about education as it relates to Black people. Thank you for the theme. I believe that Black minds, in fact, do matter. So the foundation is connected to a research center called the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at UVA, founded in 1995 by Dr. James Hunter, who's a scholar of sociology here at UVA. He's the author of Culture Wars, which many years ago helped kind of set the stage for what we see today in American culture. So at the foundation, we do a few things. We basically provide administrative support to the scholars and the postdocs who work at the Institute. We also raise funds to support our initiatives. And third, we find ourselves working as thought partners to people in the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and other places who are basically interested in trying to figure out how does culture matter to the formation of children in the K-12 sector, to adults who work in higher education, and to people across the globe in what we call late modern society.
And today we're talking about the history of schooling in America and the question posed, were schools made for Black people? And I'm going to start by going back into history and going all the way back to 1619 when the first enslaved Africans arrived here in the United States. Is this where we can start the education story of Blacks in America and probably looking at a troubled story?
So the story of Black education in the United States is actually older than the Constitution, older than the Bill of Rights, and older than the Declaration of Independence. The story of our sojourn through world history, 1619, is a start of our life on the other side of the Atlantic. Our ancestors throughout the continent of Africa, whether they were Muslim, Christian, what we would call atavists or others, they already had a system of teaching and learning. And we know that also goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, even further south to Nubia. So the idea of schooling and learning is something that we help to introduce to the world at times before learning as we know it in what we call Europe today, and even the role that the Egyptians or the Africans played in helping with the scholars or those who became the scholars in Greece. So fast forward to 1619, the Africans who arrived not too far away from here where I am in Charlottesville, in Jamestown, in fact, were not chattel slaves as we know them. Judge Leon Higginbotham, who before he died was a professor of jurisprudence at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. I was a graduate student at Harvard at the time, had the honor to take a class with him. He published a book called In the Manner of Color. And it's a book about race, about colonial politics, and about slavery in early America. And it's a book that I would recommend that anyone who's interested in history, education, law, and policy should pick up. And he basically talked about what happened in 1630 with a guy named John Punch, who was arrested along with two white colleagues and others for some activities. And John Punch, his punishment was serving his life sentence with his master, where the other two who were with him were non-black or not. So the idea that we arrived as chattel slaves as we know it today wasn't true. We surely arrived with nuanced status. We weren't citizens, but the idea of chattel slavery had not yet set in. And so when we arrived, we already arrived with the language, with the history and the culture, some of that coming from what we would call schools, but really learning institutions. And so 1619 moving forward really is a conversation about Black history on this side of the Atlantic, even though there was a Black presence in the Americas before Columbus, something that Ivan Van Sertima, in his book that came before Columbus, identified. So with me, it's just a continuation of a longer conversation. It just happened to take place in what we now call Virginia.
And as we moved forward in history and moved into and transitioned into what we know as chattel slavery, obviously stories, traditions from people who were brought from all over Africa were being exchanged, in these plantation environments, in these horrible working conditions. What was that all like? How was that happening? Because that had to have been a little difficult, because normally when you would think about a people telling stories, sharing traditions, they're doing it as a single group of people, transferring it down generation to generation. But then you have people from all parts of different parts of Africa being brought together. So how are those stories being exchanged? And at some point, all that must have been stifled.
You mentioned my involvement with HBCUs. I'm a graduate of Howard University. I also work with a number of HBCUs through a philanthropic and research perspective. Our HBCUs for over 100 years have documented exactly some of the things that you raise, whether it's scholars who looked at plantation Creole and the evolution of what we now call Black English or English, Black speaking, quote unquote, non-standard English. Mm-hmm. I think of a book called Prince Among Slaves, and it's a story about an African who was enslaved in the Americas, leaving North Carolina, who was Muslim, who was speaking. Someone heard his dialect, heard the diction, and said, wait a minute, I heard this when I was in thus and so. And so a number of Africans, of course, speaking many languages, not just one, they had to find ways to communicate. In Louisiana, you had very large concentrations of Africans who were Muslim, and a number of them created maroon colonies. When we think of maroon colonies, we only think about Jamaica. That's true. But as a scholar, I can't think of the school where she works. But she wrote a book about the Maroons in the United States. And sometimes those maroon communities were not only created because of connection in religion, this time being Islam, but also language. And they lived in swamps and other places. So language became very complicated. But as people moved away from what we would call their indigenous language to speaking English, or now what we call today as Black English, there's a scholar named Professor Dillard, who's at the University of Pennsylvania. He was the professor, my linguistics professor, Dr. Jackson, at Howard University. And there's just a long story that we don't have time to go into. But language played a big role. Some of that was driven by region and religion.
So what can you tell us about, as we view schools today, what's the first version of a Black school in the United States, and when did that happen?
There's a lot of conversation right now about Thomas Jefferson. Of course, he was a slave owner. Same thing about Thomas Jefferson, about George Washington, also a slave owner. When archaeologists conducted excavations, they actually found what we call tablets and pencils in the slave force. When they conducted similar work for Thomas Jefferson's plantation, they found tablets. And these tablets were basically what the enslaved Africans were using to teach themselves words, math, to use symbols and diagrams to communicate. This was taking place in the 1700s, at times, again, before there was a U.S. Constitution, people were involved. So there were underground schools that were taking place. Whether they were the first school, I'll let your audience decide how they wanted to define school, but there were definitely learning institutions taking place on slave plantations. At times, children, relatives, or friends of the slave owners who either moving through Christian passion or a humane approach decided, you know what, I want to help them learn. I want to teach them. And those were taking place on plantations across not only the South, because you also had slavery in the North, but there were a lot of what we call underground schools. And again, this is in the 1700s.
And then what was, I know it's almost like we're on a crazy ride through history, and we're doing way too fast, but you're there at the official conclusion of slavery, Emancipation Proclamation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we look at milestones, and the next one that pops up with this huge gap is Brown versus Board.
Yeah.
So what was going on between Emancipation and Brown versus Board?
So Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 is a great place to look, but it's not the only place to start. And that's not your question.
Yeah.
Go back to the 1800s in Boston, in the Roberts case, where there was a black family and a black girl, and the dad basically sued Boston because he said, you're not giving my daughter a chance to go to a school that's closer to our home. You're sending her to the black school. Well, the case did not work out in his favor, but what did happen in 1855 is Massachusetts passed a anti-discrimination, or better yet, an anti-segregation of schools case. 1855, almost 100 years later, you have Brown. But just think about the fact that even before then, you go back to 1740 in South Carolina. And this is important because as you're thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation, you've also got to say, well, how did we have an Emancipation Proclamation? What were we emancipating them from? It was from slavery. And who was the first state to make the big push to secede from the United States? And it was South Carolina. We'll go back to 1740. South Carolina passed a law, and I had a chance to share with some of the fellows in our Bayo class that 4 or 5 years ago, where they basically passed a law said it is illegal to teach a slave to read or to write. And to do so, there was a financial penalty that in today's terms was just astronomical. It was then. But the whole result of that was because of a botched slave rebellion that had happened. And they said, this is not going to happen because a number of the people involved in the plot were literate. And so the slave masters saw a link between literacy and liberation. So you move to 1954. One person you should definitely think about bringing on your show is Linda Brown. Her dad was Brown in the Brown v. Board of Education case. Her sister is the one you see on the book Simple Justice. She's the one you see on a lot of places. And Linda Brown and I had a chance to talk September 17th last year. And she talked about Brown. What was so interesting is that Brown wasn't just one case. It was Virginia, here in Prince Edward County. It was, D.C. and South Carolina and 2 other places. But we got to Brown because basically families said we need to, as American citizens, we have a right to our taxes. We have a right to use our money as we feel free to use. But the separate and unequal, equal isn't real. It's separate and it's unequal. So the courts took a look at it and decided unanimously that we needed to get rid of Jim Crow, moving from the front of the classroom to the back. But that story in 54 is a long trail going back again to the 1700s and moving forward. But it was a culmination of a lot of work, a lot of depth, a lot of work with the NAACP, both the organization and the Legal Defense Fund. People like Charles Hamilton Houston played in that work.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize the work that those organizations did to the research they did to form the justification and the proof that separate was not equal. That's something where a lot of people thought, well, it was just self-evident that it wasn't. But obviously, if you're going to bring something to change the law of the land, you've got to do the research.
So we look at Charles Hamilton Houston. He was really the architect of what became the Brown strategy. Most people don't know much about him. They know more about Thurgood Marshall, obviously so, first Black Supreme Court Justice. But Thurgood Marshall was one of Charles Hamilton Houston's students at Howard University when he became dean of the school. He said, I'm going to create basically the next generation of social engineers who will use the courtroom to debate what our rights are as Americans. There's a great book called The Groundwork by Dr. Jennery McNeil. She used to be a professor at University of North Carolina. She was my professor at Howard University. It's an award-winning book on the life and times of Charles Hamilton Houston and what he had to create. He was in the Army. He saw segregation firsthand. He was also the first Black to sit on law review at Harvard. He's also one of the few Americans in many ways to earn a doctorate in law from Harvard above the JD. So he was a really interesting person. And I think if you want to look at the history of using the courts for Black people as a strategy to fight for our rights and to dismantle, slowly but surely, Jim Crow, he's someone to look at along with the number of acolytes he produced along the way.
So once Brown v. Board happens, what's the immediate impact of that?
Well, all of a sudden you have 50 plus Southern district judges in the South who have to implement a desegregation clause, technically the United States, but really focused on the South. And then you have a number of Southerners who are saying, hell no, we won't do it. And so you have Brown v. Board 154, Brown v. Board 255, which moves forward with the term with all deliberate speed. But what did the Southern legislators do? They said, well, first of all, the Supreme Court, which is an unelected judiciary, can't tell states what to do with a state issue called education. So they relied on the 10th Amendment to basically say that education is a state's rights. But they went further than that. They created something that we call today the Southern Manifesto. And it was signed by at least 102 members of Congress, majority of them from the states that used to make up the Confederacy. And they basically said the judiciary is not going to tell us what to do with, quote unquote, integrating our schools. They were very clear they didn't want the Negroes at the schools. Of course, they used different terms than that. And it's just not going to happen. And so the Southern Manifesto passed. States then responded with putting together nullification acts. There's also other acts they put together. But they basically said, we're not going to do it. So from 1955 up through, let's say, 1969, you had a number of Southern states who simply put up barriers to integrate schools. In Prince Edward County from 1959 to 1964, they shut down the entire public school system, just shut it down. Blacks and whites, no place to go to school at that time. Many of them had to leave. And I've met some of those today who are still alive who had no formal education from there. They closed high schools. They took the Black teachers and principals, moved them over to the white schools, demoted them. Some of them then taking jobs as janitors and librarians, even though they had higher credentials than some of their white colleagues. So Brown just didn't arrive with a victory. Hey, we won. There was a fight we're still fighting today, but from 55 to 69, it was a big fight. And so there was a snail's pace toward trying to really desegregate schools.
Well, I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, and firsthand I experienced and saw, when as I was growing up, when I first learned about Brown v. Board and supposedly no more separate but equal, I was living in a little town of Opelousas, Louisiana. Okay. Our schools were totally segregated. Mm-hmm. My father was a school teacher. He taught at a small Black elementary school in a tiny town called Port Barry. In fact, almost all of his students were children of sharecroppers. And school would open in September, but kids wouldn't start really showing up for class until maybe a month or 2 months later, because they had to work in the fields during the school day to their parents. But it was definitely a totally separate school system. And, you know, I saw the desegregation plans that I guess were the result of subsequent court cases. I was part of the first voluntary desegregation of schools in Opelousas. My parents, and the way that worked, and I look at it now as this was maybe the first exposure of school choice, because what they did was they said if you wanted to send your child to a majority white school, you could do that. And so my parents decided to enroll us into a majority white school. I was in the 5th grade. It was me and my sister. And, you know, the strange thing now that I remember is there were only, I think, 5 students total that took advantage of that. And I'm not quite sure why. I think part of it was that maybe a lot of Black families were uncomfortable doing it. But it was just very few of us. That program lasted a year. And after that 1 year, then there was another court ruling that forced integration. And then at that point, we had white flight out of public schools. Had the segregation academies pop up overnight. And maybe talk a little bit about that history.
Yeah, so 55 to 69, that's part of the big rise of the white segregated academies in the South. Louisiana is a state that had a number. And so basically what the governor of Louisiana said is, listen, we've got to find a way to move beyond mandatory integration. So what we're going to do is we're going to create something called tuition grants. And tuition grants were publicly funded scholarships that were often given to white families only, in some cases Black families, but mostly the white families, who could use that money to go to a private school, sometimes a religious school, and create it. In 1965, 66, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights identified that it would be tough to have a private school system in the South in the absence of tuition grants being used by segregation-minded governors and school board members and superintendents to create these schools. So you had a number of Robert E. Lee academies that popped up in Louisiana and other places. In fact, you mentioned Louisiana. There was one all-Black school in Louisiana that was funded in part by this, because they say, well, listen, if the Blacks wanted, we'll give them some. But your experiment or experience about being one of the few kids to do so, I talked to families here in Virginia. They said we had 5, 6, 7. And I said, well, why not more? And they said, first of all, we were scared for our lives. A lot of parents said, I'm just not going to send my children.
But that's what I thought probably happened with us.
It was like just not, and particularly daughters. I did have one colleague, in fact, she lives here in Charlottesville. She was in Norfolk, and she said 5 dads would drive their children to school, and there were 3 daughters, 1 son, and all of the fathers had shotguns in the car, so that if anything popped off, they were going to be the second one to start popping. And so there was a whole dynamic of why people said, I'm just not going to do it. Not because they didn't think it was important, because they said it frankly wasn't worth my child. But the segregation academy piece, unfortunately, opponents of school choice use that to say that the vouchers, the tax credit programs that we have today really are just warmed over white segregation academies. That's so far from the truth. And they miss it for 3 reasons. A lot of those academies were created before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, created before the 1965 Education or Secondary Education, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which prohibited that. A lot of those came before the Supreme Court started chalking out, nope, you can't do this. Number 2, a lot of those, if you look at the language, said they were for white kids. There's no program for the 52 programs that we have in the country that are publicly funded, 500,000 plus children who had white only. And it was a lot of us in the African American community, when the laws were being passed, we were the ones to push to say, We want to make sure that you have to adhere to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Some of our colleagues in the movement didn't want it. They said, we don't want government intrusion. Well, there are times you need to have government involved. And I don't know the people who believe that should be in there. But that history was real. Do we have some of those academies in existence today? Yeah, there's some still here in this city today that are integrated, but they flowered during that massive resistance movement. So I tell my friends, when you talk to older African Americans who said, nah, we're not for that choice thing, we saw freedom of choice. That was real. I call that fear-based freedom of choice. I think what we have today is liberty-based freedom of choice. Different words, same phrase, but very different ideology.
Yeah. The interesting thing, just thinking back to that time, and again, I'm, a boy, but it was obvious to at least everyone Black in the community, everybody I knew, that these schools they popped up literally overnight. So you knew that the education there was subpar. They didn't last because these families started sending their kids back to public school pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, what started happening was they started figuring out how to do their school choice, which is the economic school choice, where we're going to move. We're going to move out of this community. And, for a town like, my small hometown, it's now just about, it's still living the legacy of that. The town is basically 100% Black. Mm-hmm. So schools are, they're still segregated, but not because of a segregation policy. There's just very few white students to integrate the school. So that whole thing, I look at it as this policy and this history actually led to the white flight that we saw from cities. And, I looked at it from the viewpoint of a small town, but obviously it really impacted big cities.
You mentioned the students who had to leave, the white flight and coming back in. I mean, it was just a tumultuous time period to be a student. And to talk to students, like in Prince Edward County, there was a 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board here in Charlottesville and the Virginia Institute for Humanities. And it was just amazing to see people walk on stage and say, my name is Clarence Jones, and I left school in the third grade in 1955, 59, and I never returned to school again. And person after person after person. And I just teared up. I mean, these people never, ever went back to school.
Yeah.
And so in 2004, the governor at the time of Virginia said that him or he and a private donor put up $1 million. And they created the Brown v. Board of Education Fund to try to provide some relief to the generation of families in Prince Edward County who were left behind because of that. And those people are alive today. You can talk to them. They'll tell you their stories. It's some heavy stuff. It really is.
Well, when you look at, a lot of all this obviously not only led to, but actually perpetuated these long-standing inequities in society, economic disparities. So can we, I think a lot of times some education reformers feel that if we just pump money into schools, that we're going to fix the problem. But they never, can we do that without looking at economic disparity in communities?
Well, I don't know. What I do know is money matters. And when people tell me it doesn't matter, I say, then give me your money. And then we'll see if it matters. So I know money matters, but often when we have a money conversation, it's a revenue discussion only. It's got to be revenue and expenditures. Let's talk about how you invest your money. There's plenty of social science research which identifies spending your money in the right categories, investing your money in the teachers who are teaching, whether they're credentialed, in course. There are a lot of things that we can do. So I would say that money matters. Schools, unfortunately, have become almost like the magic ball for us. If we can just put children in school, everything will work out well. Well, you know what? We have a lot of examples of schools who've taken children from poverty to prosperity. But we also have to not rely on schools and their teachers to be the sole ones or institutions or groups responsible for fixing or addressing economic inequality. So there's a lot that takes place outside of school. I'm on the board of a national after-school alliance, and we identified through research that between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. is where a lot of kids find themselves getting in trouble. They're not involved in after-school programs. So there's an out-of-school time component that matters a lot to trying to fix the inequities. I also think we got to work with parents. I think that's one of the great things that we focused on at BAO is that we said it's one thing to have the kids in the classroom, but they already have teachers or educators to call their parents. What can we do to work with them to give them the social capital to support, to help with their kids? The economic inequality, I just don't think you're going to find that gap closing anytime soon. A lot of that has to do with our system of economics. I support the system, but there are a lot of dynamics. So for me, I see school reform as providing an opportunity to give people a chance to put their children into schools to better themselves. Now, they may better themselves in the absence of ever closing that economic gap or addressing white supremacy or other factors that we know we want to address. My thing is, I don't want to boil the ocean to cook an egg. I'm going to take the pot that I have, the egg that I have, and the water I have, which I call education, and work with that. There's others who can work with us to do the rest.
And a couple of times you've mentioned the organization BAO. And for those who are watching this interview and may not be familiar with that, tell us about BAO and your work with BAO.
So BAO was created in the late 90s by a group of African Americans who went in Milwaukee, but they were also in other places. Dr. Howard Fuller, at that time, used to be the superintendent of schools in Milwaukee. His wife, Deborah Griff, former superintendent of schools in Detroit. But a number of African American educators, reformers, philanthropists, and others said, listen, wherever we live, wherever we go, we always find Black kids finding themselves in the worst educational conditions. Even if they're in a school that's quote unquote integrated, you find them in special classes away from everyone else. So the Black Alliance for Educational Options was created to basically give low income and working class Black families an opportunity to exercise parental options. That is within the public school system and outside the public school system, whether it was what we call vouchers, which are scholarships today, tax credits, ESAs, and the whole point. Homeschoolers. So the whole idea was there's no one lane to liberation, and that people will take different lanes. And if your lane is homeschool, what can we do to support it? If it's traditional public schools, what can you do to support it? Because we supported charters and vouchers, people considered us anti-public schools. If you look at our board, we had former public school teachers and those involved in the system on it. BAO voluntarily closed its doors a few years ago. For nearly 20 years, helped change the narrative on what reform looked like, but more importantly, moving Black children from the object of the conversation and Black families to the subject of the conversation. And I think everything we do moving forward in part is driven by the work that we supported at BAO. I was glad to be a part of the organization.
And I've had a saying about school choice that, especially the people who express doubts about it, that the school choice, even if you say you oppose it, there's always been school choice out there, and it's been their school choice, and it's school choice for those who are lucky enough to afford it, which means they can move and they can have options and make decisions for the benefit of their families.
It's funny that you say that. When you think about what you just said in the context of Black history, look at the voucher movement or the scholarship program movement in Milwaukee. It was Polly Williams, a Black woman who was a member of the legislature in Wisconsin, who had been a part of the system of trying to change it, who woke up one day and said, we've got to do something radically different. She decides to be Republican governor, Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin. They create the first urban-based voucher program for low-income families in the country. I say urban, because you already had voucher type programs already in New England. Vermont comes to mind. But it was Black people, along with others, but a Black lawmaker who made the difference. Look at New Orleans. You have a urban-based voucher program that began there some years ago. Ann Duplessis, Representative Badon, two African Americans in your state who decided we're going to take the lead on this. If you take a look at Washington, D.C., it was an African American Mayor, Tony Williams. It was Kevin Chavis, chair of the D.C. City Council. It was Rod Page, African American Secretary of Education, Dr. Howard Fuller, and a group of others who helped create a three-sector initiative that really helped to fund in a unique way vouchers, charter schools, and traditional schools. If you look in the 1970s, if you look at the Black political conventions that took place in Little Rock, Arkansas, and also in Gary, Indiana, they were talking about what we call vouchers then. Why? Because you had Black independent schools, either connected to churches or independent schools connected to the larger African movement, some of those coming out of the African independence liberation movement, who said we need to create our own schools. I taught at the Marcus Garvey School, founded in the 1970s by someone who had a similar philosophy. So the idea that what we call charters or what we call vouchers is independent of the role of Black people in influencing it is simply not true. There's really very few education movements in the United States, including alternative education, where we already didn't have a footprint.
So what do you say to some of our school choice ed reform opponents, and I'm talking about Black opponents, who say education reform hasn't worked? Not enough Black teachers, too much Teach for America, no control. What's your answer to that?
That wasn't the reason why we created the pro-choice movement. The pro-choice movement was created to do exactly what it said, to give parents an opportunity to choose where to put their children in schools. Now think about the fact that some of the parents put their kids in schools that are Catholic and they themselves are not Catholic. Doesn't mean if I go to a charter school that I have to have a non-TFA person. I can't tell you that many of the parents, in fact, know whether the teachers that kids work with are TFA or not. So I just think that's a distraction. But what's more important, if you didn't have control in charter schools, then you got to go back and look at Senator Amber Young in Minnesota, who helped create the first charter law in the United States. She created that so that teachers could practice their craft in a new way, because a lot of them said, I entered the profession to do something unique and different, but I can't. So let's create a charter school that teachers could found. You go to California, 1992, they become the second state in the country with a charter law. Both of those states only allowed teachers to create charter schools, not parents. So the whole, today, parents, nonprofits, and others create charter schools. You look at the first two states, it was primarily teachers. So even teachers themselves in a traditional system said, we want to do something different. There's research to show that TFAs, core members have had an impact in the classroom, but a lot of them who don't stay in the classroom still stay in education through philanthropy, through public policy, through government work, and through entrepreneurship. So I agree that a lot of folks, African Americans, our folks, simply think it doesn't work. At the end of the day, that's fine. When they say it takes money away from education, I said every time a child drops out of school, that takes money away from education. Every time we have a student from the school to prison pipeline, not only does it take money out of public education, but now you're putting money in the prison system, and you've likely decreased that person's net value and worth by almost $750,000 over his or her lifetime. I accept the fact that as Black people, we can agree to disagree. All I want to say is there are multiple paths to liberation, and if yours isn't on this path, just don't block us from doing it.
And today, we're at a juncture in American history that is impacting not only America, but the whole world, COVID-19. But it's impacting Blacks in this country, especially, a lot more seriously. And there's a bit of a school choice dilemma for parents now with COVID-19. And it's just this issue of feeling safe at school. And again, if you are in a school or a district where you can only go to a school based on your zip code, you're trapped, and you're fearing something that is literally deadly.
Well, here's an issue where we really have to let the families speak to local public health officials and superintendents. This is where I think is really locally driven, because you're going to have to make the decision whether to go or not. I know there's some private schools that will never open again because the closure in February or March simply led to their demise. There's some colleges in California, I can think of a couple now, that aren't going to open. So on this one, I'm going to tell parents, you really have to spend time listening to what your local leaders have to say, public health, educators, and others. You can listen national if you want to, and there's a dynamic as to why that is taking place. But on this one, I would say look low.
Well, on that, we're going to close it. We're going to wish you the best of health as we continue to battle this pandemic. And Gerard Robinson, this has been, you've allowed me in giving me some personal leeway to go back to my childhood and remember some things. So, yeah, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Black Minds Matter. Thank you so much.
I'd like to leave you with this piece as we're talking about history. When the Northern troops traveled through the South, of course, fighting against the Confederates, a number of them wrote in their diaries, and a number of them shared stories when they returned home of all these underground Black schools that they kept running across, where they found books, where they found tablets and other educational materials all throughout the South. So even during the Civil War, when you had some Blacks who were with the Confederates, and of course you had a lot more of the Blacks who were with the Union, they were basically saying, no matter who wins this war, we're not going to be a slave anymore because education is going to matter. And so when they got to Georgia, there was a conversation with one leader of the Union, and he said, well, what should I tell the people when I return home? And the young boy said, Massa, tell them we are rising. Now that's the sanitized version. What he really said was, Massa, tell them we be rising. Now think about it. Tell them we be rising. He's saying that because in the midst of slavery, he knew education was his rise. And so then the Civil War ends, you have the Reconstruction legislatures in the South, Louisiana being one. And as Du Bois showed us in his research, Du Bois said you don't have a universal free public education in the system in the South without the formerly enslaved Africans who are now members of the legislature. And why one of the first things they really push in education is because all along they were liberating themselves in the absence of school. We're in 2020, we're just following a trajectory that goes back to Africa, but on this side of the Atlantic, 1619 to the present, and we still rise.
Our thanks to Gerard Robinson. We invite you to join us for our next Black Minds Matter interview.
All right. Thank you, Gerard. And Denisha, I know we had some questions that were submitted. I think you may be on mute.
Yeah, we had a lot of questions come in. So let me scroll up because we had some more. And if you guys have any questions, still put them in the chat. And we are very much looking forward to tackling this big interview and talking about the history of education in America. So, Paul, the first question looks like that we have is, how are educators stuck in inequitable systems? How can they help their students? So students who are stuck in schools that might not work for them, how can teachers help them?
Well, I think teachers can help by really, if a kid is stuck in a system and, they don't have any options, is to really just give them that one-on-one, as much one-on-one assistance as they can. The other thing I would hope is that the teacher and even the school would explore and see if there are options. And sometimes there are options that go beyond just going to a different school. There's resources, the age that we're in now, the resources are just numerous. They're unending. So I think the key thing is if you are physically stuck in a school situation, then it's resources. And now that we're in COVID-19, we're looking at resources that we never thought we had before. I think somebody had popped a comment up on the screen while the interview was taking place and talked about learning pods and things like that. Here in the city of New Orleans, the city just announced through their recreation department that they're going to have some pods. And I think it's more of a, maybe not an education system type thing, but I think it's a safe teaching and learning environment for students who don't have the access to Wi-Fi and that type of thing, where you can bring these pods together to learn in a safe place.
Yeah, exactly. I definitely agree, because there are, especially like you said, during this time of COVID, so many grassroots efforts. I literally see like a commercial a day of teachers and students creating tutorial services for students, especially during this time, who may have, kind of fallen behind due to COVID. So, and I would definitely say I was stuck personally in a school that didn't fit my needs. From till 5th grade, I went to my zone public school and it didn't fit my needs. I failed the 3rd grade twice. And there were some teachers who were trying to do their best to help me. They had their hands tied too, because they had to be under a system. But they did all that they could to make sure that I was trying to get a quality of education. Unfortunately, it helped a little bit, but because the system was inequitable, but there are additional resources. Let's go to the next question. Let's see. So in 2020, is integration a necessary precursor for creating a greater equity within our system? What's the relationship between race and funding? Very good question. And she gave an example of New York spends 2 times the national average per pupil, which is very true. And then you still have so many students who are performing below grade level. And it's not just New York. Many states are spending so much more per pupil than the average scholarship or the average charter school to educate kids, and in some instances are doing a better job. But Paul, what's your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, just the general thought about this connection between funding and education and education success. Unfortunately, it's almost like it's a cycle that's very hard to break, because the fundamental way that public schools are funded is a good portion of that funding is based on local property taxes. So if you live in a neighborhood or a city that has higher property values, that school system gets funded better. Well, how do you have higher property taxes? You have more expensive property, so you need people who can afford it. It's people who are already in the lead on the economic ladder. So based on being in the lead, they get to live in areas that have higher property tax, higher home values, and the people who aren't in the lead economically, they live in neighborhoods with lower values. So their system, if they're in the public school system, is underfunded. So just that fundamental, it's like an economic trap that's very hard to break. But I don't want people to misunderstand and think that the solution is funding, because we've seen that it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, when the average funding of a public school is $15,000 per student in this country, but we see the just bad education outcomes across the board, then we know the solution's not there. but unfortunately, I think it's just a bad starting point.
But
So those are my thoughts.
What do you think about the first part of the question about integration? Because you and Gerard touched on integration within your interview. And so, yeah, what do you think about that in aiding or the progression of education?
Well, in the interview, I told Gerard about the hometown that I'm from, which is now just about 100% Black, which means that there's really no integration, but it's not segregated because of any, breaking of law or anything like that. It goes right back to economics. So with all the efforts that have taken place over the last even 60 years to integrate schools, because of economics, you still have that segregation. So there's a link. I don't know if purposeful desegregation leads to a solution, because again, that's where we are now, is we had the purposeful desegregation and it wasn't the solution.
Yeah. I think it's a big, and I don't think we have time. So that might have to be another episode in Black Minds Matter, talking about integration, because there are a lot of mixed views on that topic.
Oh yeah. And I know you're going to have a future Black Minds Matter talking about if we could design basically our own Wakanda. And some of that thinking, and I think some of your panelists are going to say and espouse that, as African Americans, we need to take this over and do it ourselves. I anticipate that's what we're going to hear, right?
We'll see.
We'll see.
We'll see. The next question: do you think parents should send? Do you think parents should send their kids to private school? Is that what this school choice movement is all about? Just picking kids up out of the public education system and putting them in a private school?
No, and even though I know, Denisha, that's where you went and it led to your success. That's not the purpose of school choice in general. It's, if that private school fits your needs and it's the best option, then yeah, your kid should go there. But it's not the end all goal. Charter schools are a big part of the school choice movement, and charter schools are public schools.
Yeah. And, I think it was, even though I asked the question, I think it's a very helpful question, because people do oftentimes get that a little bit confused. They say, well, you're just all about privatizing education. But like you said, that's definitely not the case. And Gerard, what he talked about in the interview is, these early tuition grants that were given solely to white Americans to send their kids to private schools, that was very different from the type of choice we have now. He
schooled me on that, because even though I was living in that era, I had no idea that those families who were leaving to go to those segregation academies, I thought they were paying to do that. I didn't know that a lot of them were actually getting help from the state, from the government. So I was schooled.
Well, and it makes so much sense, because oftentimes you see and hear opponents who are Black and brown, who say, this is just a way for you to, and now it kind of makes sense. It's like, oh, you're remembering a different version of how he said forced choice versus freedom of choice. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we have to remember. Anything that empowers somebody and gives them the freedom to choose, that's not forcing anybody to go into a specific system. Let's see. Okay, let's see. From Liz, she said, for my students enrolled in my school's summer program, teachers hold Google Meets, where the students follow along with the teacher, exercising and playing interactive games. Cool.
I like it.
Awesome. Oh, I think she was answering a question. She was answering a question about PE. Okay. Let's see if we have any other questions.
think you had a question about unions. I can't remember exactly what the question was, but when I saw it flash across the screen, my thought was about unions. Yeah, that status quo. And unions love the status quo. And we're seeing it right now with COVID-19, where unions are very resistant to, they're fighting for the safety of their teachers, but in the end, I think where they're going to go is they're going to want things to go back exactly the way they were. They've always fought against innovation. And what I'm seeing right now with COVID-19 reminds me of what we saw in New Orleans right after Hurricane Katrina, and not so much with education, but with the recovery of the city in general, where there was talk about, let's change the city, make it more efficient, make it flood friendly, and that type of thing. And what happened was the impetus, especially from the existing political structure, was let's rebuild New Orleans exactly the way it was. And it was like, let's recreate a 1955 Oldsmobile in 2005. And I just see this love of the status quo, and I thought that was a good question from our person who submitted it.
Yeah, we could talk about the unions all day because their tactics are really mafia-like. I'm just going to be honest. There are some research studies that actually correlate in the teachers' union tactics, and anyway, I say that because it is very helpful. We have some dynamic teachers who are on, and I think it was a teacher who posed that question, who are aware and knowledgeable that sometimes the teachers' unions don't have the best interests of their teachers and not even our students at heart. And so I thank you guys. I want to give a big shout out to you for always doing the help, all the work that's needed to make sure that our Black bodies have a quality education in their minds. And to close out this event, Paul, do you have any last words? Anything you want to leave the people with?
No, I'm just thankful I had an opportunity to spend almost an hour conversing with Gerard Robinson, and after it ended, for the next several days, all these questions that I said, oh, I should have asked that question, should have asked this. So it was great.
Yeah, I've looked at it, and it will be posted on YouTube for everybody to go back and watch, and to get the book suggestions that he talked about, and to do deeper dives into each one of those topics. Very informative. So thank you so much, Paul, for bringing it to us. And that concludes our event. Our next event will be on August the 13th, and we are going to be talking about Wakanda. What will schools look like in Wakanda? So go back and watch Black Panther to refresh yourselves, but that was such an amazing movie. And so we have a dynamic panel of the Wakanda women, that's what I'm gonna call them. And that's gonna be so awesome. So you see right there on the screen, we'll be live again on Facebook and on YouTube, 4 p.m. on August the 13th, that's next week. So please put it in your calendars, and we will see you then.